Welcome. I'm Professor Rob Wolcott with the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. I'm here today at the Santa Fe Institute in Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is in many ways the birthplace of complexity theory, chaos, a whole lot of other visions of the future of humanity. One of the people I have the privilege to work with today here at the Institute is Mr. John Clippinger. John founded ID Cubed. He's a member of the MIT Media Lab and has spent a number of years in the past at the Harvard Law School. So in his range of his career, he's seen this challenge from multiple dimensions. John, welcome and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
So given all the things you think about it, and it's a lot, I first have to say thank you. You were the first person, this was probably about 4 years ago when we met in Jackson Hole for a conference. You were the first person to introduce to me the notion of the blockchain. And it wasn't just the Bitcoin, cryptocurrencies, I mean, that people have started to talk a lot about that. But even at that time, you were saying this underlying methodology of blockchain. What else can we do with it? How can we change the way that people organize and contract? And that opened my mind ever since. So what are you interested in today?
Well, I'm very much interested in new forms of organization. I think that we're at a critical juncture right now where we're seeing the systemic failures of a lot of institutions of industrial democracy. And it's not just in the US, it's pervasive. And what we're starting to see is the emergence of a new way of social ordering. It's more decentralized. And so when I mentioned the blockchain is one component of that. And what we're starting to see is that rather than having a central notion of authority, you can have distributed forms of authority, distributed forms of organization that are self-organizing. And this has been brought about by new technologies. It's not just the blockchain itself. It's not just machine learning. It's a combination of mobile phones, the things you can do off of mobile phones, the data you can get off mobile phones, GPS. You have also the ability to create virtual containers of information in the cloud. And so we're creating networks and networks around the world that are challenging the traditional ways in which we've governed ourselves as nation states. They're traditionally sort of a top-down hub and spoke model to something that's much more distributed. The power is not in the center, it's at the edge. And so there are very fundamental changes that are taking place. And then you compound that with new kinds of technologies that are coming on, all the way from new kinds of neuroscience, synthetic biology, to machine learning, to AI, that we're creating a whole new environment. And so we have to have new ways of thinking about it. And the thing that I've been concentrating on is what I call an open sector. It's not the public sector, it's not the private sector, and it's not under the control of a government or even, say, UN or something like that. It's almost a set of open protocols. So we espouse a notion of self-sovereign identity, self-sovereign data, which is a sort of a radical concept because it's not, but it's in the protocol itself.
Is it some sort of shadow sector that cuts across the established sectors of society?
I wouldn't call it a shadow sector, but it's certainly like a meta sector. It's something between. It's an outgrowth of the open sector, the open source sector. So the whole concept of open source software, the building, which has now taken over software development, where you have collaborations across different organizations. No one owns it. It's owned by everybody and nobody. Yeah. And so you want to have a space where it's safe to genuinely innovate and fundamentally innovate and not be under the thumb of a particular interest. And so what we found in looking and say working in different cities and trying to do genuine innovation in smart cities and things like that, is that once you try to do things, say, through a public-private partnership, that each of those parties say, well, no, I want to have it twisted here, I want to have it done this, I want to keep our interest at stake. And so they try to fold back the innovation in terms of what allows them to keep their legacy
to fit it into the existing box,
existing categories,
maintain control.
And this is where something like open source and even the things like Burning Man, that whole where you have a tabula rasa, you have a green field where you can generally
or a desert actually,
a desert field, so to speak. Yes, a desert field. You have a desert where there's nothing there, and whatever you do is what you create. And you're free to create anything. There's no expectation. It's a radical notions of invention. So we have networks and networks, and part of that is this kind of architecture is and it ties into what's been done here in complexity sciences, is if you have really complex control processes, that's the only way you can scale control in a decentralized phase.
But explain that for us, because by saying, for many people, if you say we have to have a complex control system, then that evokes notions of very difficult, very hard to understand, difficult to implement. But you're not saying that, right? You're
No.
We've talked earlier about emergent governance, evolvable governance. Tell us about that.
I mean, the thing is, rather than try to impose a set of rules, you try to create a set of initial conditions that which people's rules come out of and principles come out of. I mean, one of the ways of looking at this is common law. And one of the best pieces that ever been written in common law is by Holmes, Oliver Wendell Holmes, and this is like in 1878, and he wrote a very powerful piece on common law. And he went back to common law, began with customs, and then norms, and then it gets codified in laws, and they're constantly evolving. So they're emergent. It wasn't something that was top down. And it was constantly reinventing itself around the circumstances, and there was no single point of control. So we think of things like digital common law. What's equivalent of digital common law? And that's something that should reside in an open sector that is not under the thumb of any particular legacy interest. The problem of genuine innovation is that each party, whether it be in the public sector or the private sector, wants to preserve their standing within the current status quo.
Right.
And now we're talking about things that are profoundly transformative. They're transitional. And so that has to be the freedom to be in this new sector.
So give us an example of an open sector kind of an environment that already exists.
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, I think you can look at the open source software movement as part of an open sector. But what we're looking at is how do you create a protocol, for example, that allow people to get an identity that be verified, to be biometrically, behaviormetrically verified, that other authorities, public and private sector, could accept, but it's not controlled by them. And my own data is something that I would control under a set of protocols or rules that go in the cloud that would not be under necessarily the jurisdiction of a particular government. And the reason this is important is that as more and more data is collected about ourselves, our digital selves, our digital subject, is going to be something that either we control or some other party controls. Right now, it's captured by different companies, Googles and the Facebooks.
Right.
And so if there's going to have any kind of real independent freedom, then we have to have access and control over that. And that would exist in this new sector.
So would an organization like ICANN be representative of this, or is this an older version of
that's a really
transitional model, for instance?
I'm of the opinion that's like a transitional model. I mean, and so ICANN, I'm very close to the people.
In other words, governing the internet, the rules of engagement on the internet.
Right, and then that was for an allocation of names and the domain space. Right. But here we're trying to get a consensus as to what is a digital credential that is acceptable that then allows certain parts of commerce to take place and people to express themselves freely and form new kinds of organizations and economies. And this is where the cryptocurrency comes in. This is where not just Bitcoin, but there's a proliferation of other kind of coins. And you can create different kinds of decentralized banks and decentralized authorities and institutions this way.
Such as the experiment in Ethereum and groups
That's
like
right,
this.
Ethereum. And Ethereum is one example of that. Yeah. So there's a whole community of people who are looking at how to create these alternatives with anticipation that the current institutional frameworks are being extremely challenged.
Right, and there's a lack of trust in many of our existing institutions.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think it's going to saying too far. That a lot of people think the financial reforms that we've had are not working. They haven't got far enough, and it's just a matter of time where we're going to have another crisis. And then you compound that with other crises of legitimacy and governments and voting and the kinds of leadership that's out there now, that we're at a critical point in the next couple of years.
So far we've been at a very macro and even theoretical level. But let's look at a specific example, something you've been very involved in for a while, the Burning Man. Briefly, for anyone who doesn't know what it is, and maybe there are 7 people who still don't, but tell people briefly what it is, and then how does this relate to your notion of open sector?
Okay, I mean, so Burning Man is You could describe it as a 2-week festival that it takes place in Black Rock Desert, and it's been going for over 25 years.
Wow.
And it started as a small group, and now there's up to 70,000 people each year. And what they do is they come out and they have 10 principles by which they govern themselves. And it's sort of like a spontaneous, self-organizing community where it's a gift exchange system. There's no currency. It's like, and it's predicated on art. And so it's sort of a combination of art and humor and self-deprecation, in which people create phenomenal pieces of art in the desert. And they have things like art cars, and they sort of emulate or imitate new current sort of world institutions in what they call the default world. In the
So the rest of us are in the default
world. Now, what's happened with Burning Man is that there are Burning Man organizations around the world. So they're burners around the world. And they're setting up their own parallel efforts. Mm-hmm. And there is an experiment in new kinds of living and social ordering that are very much bottom up, not top down, around sets of principles.
And something that seems to be consistent across many of these emergent systems, governance systems, organizations, open sector, is a small set of clear principles.
Right.
And then people act around those principles, through those principles, but what they do emerges up from the grassroots.
Absolutely. I mean, one of the lessons of Burning Man, and having talked to the founders, they had a sort of existential moment in Burning Man about 1995 or 96, where it was a festival, people coming together, but there wasn't sufficient structure. It sort of became Mad Max.
Right.
And they had some deaths, and it went over the edge. And so they had to start to think about what sort of principles, what sort of like simple orderings that they could put down and how they organized the camps that would lead to more civil behavior. Mm. And that innovation is what really resulted in Burning Man as we now know it, and scaling to 70,000 people that come together, that people who do not necessarily know each other, and are able to have this really civil experience.
Interesting. So that evolution occurred as a result of a response to an existential crisis.
Oh yeah,
it
could have gone down. That could have been the end of it. The Bureau of Land Management could have closed them down.
Right. And there was talk of that.
Yeah, there was talk about, and they have those moments from time to time. They have other challenges.
Right.
And so it's always about how much you do from top down to bottom up. And sometimes you need a nudge from the top, and sometimes you allow things to come up from the bottom.
Right.
So it is sort of a living experiment. It's trial and error. And the challenge is, how do you go from something like it's a festival to something as permanent communities around on a global basis? So we had a retreat that we brought together people around the world, and they're starting to discuss how to scale Burning Man. And so there are a lot of challenges in that. I think Burning Man is just one example of a lot of similar efforts that you see around the world.
Yeah.
So there are these festivals, there is this kind of thinking about new kind of social ordering, and particularly among a millennial generation who think of their place and how they gather and what's legitimate and not legitimate in their world and what to be trusted than more of the traditional structures. So it's a leading indicator, I think, of some of these things that happen.
So this open sector truly starts to overlap with and directly interact with the more traditional sectors of
That's
society.
exactly right. You want something to compete with the traditional sector,
Right.
and that it is subsumed more, as it starts to be more effective and gets genuine authority, genuine legitimacy, then it's going to shape both the sectors.
Right.
And it'll grow on its own. It doesn't necessarily have to dominate. It's sort of a co-evolution, as it were.
Interesting. Burning Man has always struck me a little bit as a 21st century analog of some of the ferment of the mid-19th century in the United States, so the utopian communities and trying to find new ways to order socially and all of this. Not that anyone's suggesting that Burning Man is a utopia. It certainly might feel like that for a couple weeks.
Right.
But you mentioned other examples around the world. Can you think of another open sector relevant example where people are experimenting with this kind of a construct?
Well, there are various like communal groups. They're in Spain. There's groups in Spain, and Italy, and Greece. There are all these spontaneous collaboratives that are coming up, and they in Berlin, and so and a lot of them in urban areas, because when you have, and the nation state is sort of not a very effective way of organizing things, so it goes back to the city and say, oh, how do we create regions of a city that reflect these values and it's a level of governance that people can participate and be effective in.
Right.
So you're seeing a lot of different cities about how to do this, create these new kind of self-ordering ordering communities.
Right. These are monumental changes we'll be seeing in the next couple of generations. How do you think about this as an individual or a leader? What if I'm a citizen of the world and I'm looking at these changes that are being wrought around me? How do I think differently, act differently to prepare to be engaged in a positive way as an individual and then also as a leader?
Well, I feel this is really this is critical stuff. I think that there's a real responsibility to think about it and not sort of to deny it. And typically what you'll have is, and one person described as innovation theater. Oh, we'll innovate, we'll act it out, but it's a way of inoculating ourselves from actually really then looking at it. So this whole transition from sort of hub and spoke, top-down industrial democracy into a decentralized service represents a huge change and shift in power and influence into institutional forms. And is it going to be a soft landing, a hard landing, or a landing at all? I mean, how do we do that? Right. And I think that's it's happening a lot faster than we think. And I think that we have to sort of look at the hard facts and be able not to try to put a spin on it or deny it, but to be as clear as we can. And as leaders, I think people have a requirement to understand this. And a lot of people say, oh, this is technology and I'll have someone else. No, you have an obligation to understand this.
Right.
And that is, I mean, I find in having, say, go to China with a lot of engineers, Chinese leaders in it, they get this stuff. You don't have that literacy so much in the U.S.
One of the things I admire about your background is it's quite diverse. You've had executive roles at for-profit companies, including Coopers and Lybrand for a number of years.
Yep.
What advice would you give to senior leaders of business in terms of how they need to be addressing these changes and challenges?
I think this is, this is really tricky, because I think that businesses have to get on the learning curve and they start to have to doing experiments. They have to be engaged, and I don't think it's enough to sort of have people come in and sort of explain to them and over a period of time. I think they have to sort of start making real commitments to experiments. So you'll see what's happening in the banking world. That there are over 50, 60 banks are now experimenting with the blockchain. But they're just experiments. And
Which
think,
at this phase is probably the right thing to do. I mean, you don't want to go big before...
No, it's true, because it's early. So
right.
I think it's early. But I think they need to learn how to think in these terms and acculturate themselves in these terms. What so often is they say, oh, we'll wait till it matures and then we'll jump in. And I wrote a piece on this with an institutional investor, and that's what the newspapers did. And look where it got them. And I think the banks are vulnerable to the same thing. But it's not just banks, it's also governments, governance, and how to think what their role is. And their position and their privilege in that process is going to be challenged. So there's a real need for leaders to take their organization and get up on the learning curve as quickly as they can and start doing projects and understand and viscerally experience what this is going to be.
Related to this question, and we're coming down to the conclusion of the interview, but you can edit this. So related to this question, these new open sector opportunities are rising. Clearly, we're already seeing reframing of society, social institutions, privacy, people's relationships to each other. Supranational organizations are under great stress, whether that's United Nations or NATO, et cetera. Right. So the world is being redrawn. Nonetheless, we are generally organized into more traditional types of social structures, whether they're corporations or national governments, supranational governments. What advice would you give to leaders of these kinds of large business, national governments? They're still vital, they're still critical. Meanwhile, though, the level of trust across the board, across the planet, has plummeted for them. What advice would you give them to try and remain relevant in this changing world?
I think that it's not like they're going to go away. I don't think that you're going to. But I think it's like it's organic. Their role will change a bit, and I think so the role of the state may be to create it's sort of like a meta role, that a lot of the power will go to more a local level. So it may go to the cities. And they may have a higher level coordination role, and there's certain things they're going to do, and things are going to be more networked. I think you're seeing networks of cities linking to cities, and so cities are naturally forming their own alliances and affinities among themselves because they reflect commercial, cultural connections.
Yeah.
So
and I think Richard Daley said all politics are local.
Yep.
Perhaps it was somebody before him.
No, it was Tip O'Neill.
Tip O'Neill.
Yeah, it's another Irishman.
All right, there we go.
Right.
Great.
But yeah, and so how you design local currencies, you're going to have new kinds of currency, and so it's like, well, rather than try to get involved in the particulars and hold on to sort of legacy influence, set the meta rules and recognize that. But that's a huge challenge. But I think that they're going to lose influence. I mean, and what's going to happen is that it's a default. City's going to assume a much bigger role because they're going to be these failures. So people default to the city. They're going to default to these more private organizations, and that's where the open sector is really important. Let it flourish, and then and it can make mistakes, and then glean out what starts to work, and then it can be codified.
And then it becomes part of a natural evolutionary
evolutionary process, rather than try to cap it down and over regulate all its particulars.
That's particularly interesting because I see a direct analog to what we're doing with corporations now, trying to think through how the economy and business value chains and ecosystems are changing. So with all of these technologies that you know better than anyone, the blockchain and distributed energy generation and 3D printing and all these things, they distribute agency, the ability to make decisions. They distribute access to information. Sensing, Internet of Things, all these things. They distribute the ability to produce things at smaller, more granular levels in the economy. And so therefore what we're seeing happening in business, this will continue over the next couple generations, is we're pushing the production and provision of products and services ever closer to the moment of demand.
Absolutely right.
And when you realize that foresight, you see how every business ecosystem is going to get ripped apart over the next 20 or 30 years.
Right.
And you're seeing a similar dynamic happening within government, society, governance, et cetera.
Yeah, so whether you talk the sharing economy, the on-demand economy, the whole ability to have things data-driven and basically on-demand is changing. So you can see this with happening in ride-hailing services and things like that. So you got GPS. So you're going to have a way of dynamically allocating your transportation infrastructure is going to be, rather than be fixed, it'll be dynamic. I think work, what kind of jobs I get, what kind of credentials I have are going to be dynamic. And so it's not going to be these fixed structures anymore. And it's going to be data driven in the sense, so you're going to be mitigating risk in real time, and computing risk, and that's where the machine learning becomes a big deal. Right. So it's like the highly dynamic system that's going to be taking place around all categories of society.
You are one of those people in the world that has had the privilege to work on things you're clearly passionate about for a very long time. What is one thing that you are most proud of in the work that you've done in your life? It's something you'd like to be, I guess, let's be honest, remembered for.
Well, that's hard. The thing that meant the most to me was Selma. From a technology point of view, is that I've always been interested in the area of self-organizing systems. For 30 years. And that wasn't always the most current thing. And now to see these things coming together, and people talking about the concept of self-sovereign identity and all that, and that actually is now part of a broader conversation. The Treasury and the EU and all these things are now starting to get adopted. and which they were considered to be really way out ideas just 5 or 6 years ago. That makes me feel good. And if that happens and that is really institutionalized and that becomes scale, I feel a sense of accomplishment in that, because that's something that I've been advocating my whole life. So that is important to me.
Well, it's also important to all the rest of us, John. Thanks so much for your work over the years.